The gentle creaking of a wooden rocking chair filled the air as Mrs. Rose sat on her wraparound porch, her weathered hands smoothing out the fabric of her favorite floral dress. At 73, she had earned every silver strand in her hair through decades of teaching young minds at the local elementary school. The late afternoon sun painted golden stripes across her well-tended garden, where marigolds and zinnias danced in the warm breeze. This house on Oak Street had been her sanctuary for over 40 years. She remembered the day she and her late husband first walked through its doors, young and full of dreams. Now, the Victorian-style home stood as a testament to their love and hard work, every creaky floorboard and worn banister holding memories of family gatherings, children's laughter, and countless Sunday dinners. From her vantage point on the porch, Mrs. Rose could see Mrs. Chen watering her prized roses next door, and old Mr. Thompson walking his spotted beagle across the street. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon that made her grateful for choosing to retire in the same neighborhood where she'd spent most of her adult life. The familiar sounds of children playing basketball a few houses down mixed with the chirping of birds in her maple tree. She reached for her glass of fresh squeezed lemonade, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass. The recipe was her grandmother's, a perfect balance of sweet and tart that always reminded her of childhood summers in Georgia. As she took a sip, her eyes drifted to the family photos she'd just been organizing, spread out on the small table beside her chair. There was something comforting about revisiting these memories, seeing the faces of loved ones captured in moments of joy. The neighborhood cat, a friendly orange tabby that everyone called Sunshine, had just hopped onto her porch railing for his daily visit when the peaceful scene was suddenly shattered. 2 police cruisers pulled up to her curb, their tires crunching against the gravel. The harsh sound seemed out of place in the quiet afternoon, like a thunderclap from a clear sky. Mrs. Rose's hands tightened slightly around the arms of her rocking chair as she watched the officers step out of their vehicles. Something about their purposeful stride and stern expressions made her heart beat a little faster, though she kept her composed exterior. After all, this was her home, her porch, her sanctuary. The rookie officer's hand rested casually on his belt as he approached, while his older partner scanned the property with practiced eyes. The screen door behind Mrs. Rose creaked softly in the breeze, and Sunshine darted away, startled by the unexpected visitors. The peaceful afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would shake not just Mrs. Rose's world, but the entire community's understanding of what it meant to stand up for what's right. She could hear Mrs. Chen's water hose shut off next door, and Mr. Thompson had stopped walking his beagle. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath as the officers mounted the first step of her porch, their boots heavy against the aged wood. Mrs. Rose straightened her spine, years of dignity and resilience evident in her posture as she prepared to face whatever was coming her way. The younger officer cleared his throat, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. "Ma'am, we've received reports of suspicious activity in this area," he announced, his voice carrying an edge that seemed unnecessary for addressing an elderly woman peacefully sitting on her porch. Mrs. Rose's lemonade glass paused halfway to her lips as she processed his words. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated softly, her voice carrying the warm tone she used for decades to calm anxious first graders. "Officer, I've been sitting here all afternoon, enjoying the weather and sorting through old family photos." She gestured to the scattered photographs on the table beside her, memories frozen in time. The senior officer stepped forward, his shadow falling across her garden pictures. "We'll need to see some identification," he stated, less of a request and more of a demand. His hand rested casually on his belt, a posture that might have seemed natural to him, but felt unnecessarily intimidating to anyone watching. Mrs. Rose's chest tightened slightly, but her expression remained calm. The same expression she'd worn through 4 decades of parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings. "Young man," she began, her voice steady despite the growing tension, "I've owned this house for 40 years. I'm sitting on my own porch." The neighborhood had gone eerily quiet. The basketball game down the street had stopped, the bounce of the ball falling silent. Mrs. Chen had moved closer to her fence, foam in hand, watching with concerned eyes. Even Mr. Thompson and his beagle stood frozen on the sidewalk, bearing witness to the unfolding scene. "That may be so," the younger officer pressed, shifting his weight forward, "but we've had reports. and we need to verify your residence." His partner added, "It won't take long if you cooperate. Just show us your ID." The way he emphasized cooperate made it sound like a threat rather than a suggestion. Mrs. Rose's hands, which had graded countless papers and wiped away children's tears, folded calmly in her lap. "Officers," she said, her dignity wrapped around her like armor, "I understand you're doing your job. But I'm doing nothing wrong, and I don't appreciate the implication that I'm trespassing on my own property." A small crowd had begun to gather. The Wilson kids from across the street stood on their lawn, phones raised discreetly. Old Mrs. Peterson had wheeled herself onto her porch 2 doors down, her nurse standing protectively behind her chair. The community was watching, and the tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife. The younger officer's radio crackled, making everyone jump slightly. He ignored it, focusing instead on Mrs. Rose with growing frustration. "Ma'am, if you don't provide identification, we'll have to." "Have to what?" Mrs. Rose interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had commanded classrooms for years. "Have to arrest a grandmother for sitting on her own porch? For enjoying the afternoon air? For living in her own home?" Each question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The senior officer's face heightened. "We have procedures to follow," he insisted, taking another step forward. The wooden boards of the porch creaked under his feet, a sound that seemed to echo in the tense silence. "If you continue to resist—" "I'm not resisting anything," Mrs. Rose stated firmly, though her heart was racing beneath her calm exterior. "I'm exercising my right to exist peacefully in my own space, something I've done every day for the past 40 years. Her voice carried across the porch, reaching the growing audience of neighbors who had gathered to witness the scene. The atmosphere grew heavier as the officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to handle this situation that was rapidly spinning beyond their control. Their training hadn't prepared them for an elderly woman who knew her rights and refused to be intimidated, all while maintaining the poise of a seasoned educator. A car engine rumbled in the distance, growing louder as it approached the scene. The sound seemed to catch everyone's attention, like the approaching footsteps in a theater drama. Something was about to change, and everyone on that quiet street could feel it. The confrontation had reached a tipping point, and help was about to arrive from an unexpected direction. The pressure in the air was almost visible now, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Mrs. Rose remained seated in her rocking chair, her back straight as a ruler, just as she'd taught her students to sit during morning announcements. The family photos on the table beside her showed faces of loved ones who'd fought their own battles for dignity, faces that seemed to be watching the scene unfold. "I'll say it one more time," she spoke, her voice carrying the patience of someone who'd explained complex multiplication to struggling students. "This is my home. I've lived here since before either of you officers were born. I'm not going inside to get my ID because I shouldn't have to prove I belong on my own porch." The neighbors had formed an impromptu audience, their presence growing by the minute. The Lopez family from the blue house down the street stood quietly on their lawn. Mrs. Chen had moved even closer, her garden hose forgotten, water pooling at her feet. The Wilson kids were now live-streaming the entire incident, their young faces tight with concern. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, perhaps finally realizing the gravity of their mistake. But his partner, the senior officer, seemed determined to push forward. "Ma'am, your stubbornness is only making the situation worse," he said, his tone carrying a warning that made several neighbors murmur in disapproval. Mrs. Rose's hands smoothed her dress, a gesture she performed countless times when gathering her thoughts before addressing a difficult parent conference. "Officer," she replied, her voice steady but tired. "I've lived through times when people who looked like me couldn't drink from certain water fountains. I've seen signs that told us where we could and couldn't exist. I've watched my parents stand their ground with far more courage than I'm showing now." She paused, letting her words sink in. "So no, I won't be going inside to prove I belong here." A gentle breeze stirred the wind chimes she'd received as a retirement gift, their soft melody a stark contrast to the tension-filled scene. Old Mr. Thompson had finally moved closer, his beagle whining softly at the unusual atmosphere. The dog's distress seemed to mirror the community's collective anxiety. "Look around you," Mrs. Rose continued, gesturing to her well-tended garden. "Those rose bushes were planted by my late husband 30 years ago. That tire swing held my grandchildren. Every crack in this sidewalk, every blooming flower in that garden, every creaky board on this porch tells our family's story. Her voice carried no anger, only a profound weariness mixed with determination. The senior officer's radio crackled again, more insistently this time. He ignored it, his face flushing with what might have been embarrassment or anger, or perhaps both. "This isn't about your flowers or your porch, ma'am. This is about following proper procedure." "No," Mrs. Rose interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp as a teacher calling an unruly class to order. "This is absolutely about my flowers and my porch. This is about being able to exist peacefully in the space I've called home for 4 decades without having to justify my presence." Mrs. Peterson, still watching from her wheelchair 2 doors down, called out in her quavering voice, "She's telling the truth, officers. Rose has lived here longer than anyone else on this street." Her nurse nodded vigorously, adding her own silent support to the statement. The crowd had grown larger now. Cars were slowing as they passed, some stopping altogether. Phones were recording, faces were concerned, and the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone could sense that this wasn't just about one woman on her porch anymore. It had become something bigger, something that touched on deeper truths about dignity, respect, and the right to feel safe in one's own home. The younger officer's hand had moved away from his belt, but his partner's remained there, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against the leather. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. It could tip either way, towards resolution or escalation. That's when they all heard it. The sound of tires squealing around the corner, heading their way. Something was about to change, and the entire street held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The black SUV came to a sudden stop in front of the house, its tires gripping the pavement with urgency. The crowd parted like waves as a tall man in a crisp business suit stepped out, his briefcase still clutched in one hand. He was Mrs. Rose's son, a successful attorney who'd earned his reputation fighting for civil rights in courtrooms across the state. His eyes took in the scene before him, his mother sitting with quiet dignity in her rocking chair, surrounded by 2 officers whose body language spoke of mounting tension. The family photos were still scattered on the small table, faces of ancestors who'd fought their own battles for justice watching over this moment. "Mom," he called out, his voice carrying both concern and authority as he strode up the walkway. The younger officer turned sharply at his approach, while the senior officer's hand tightened visibly on his belt. The son's footsteps were measured, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years spent studying law and justice. Mrs. Rose's face softened at the sight of her son, though she maintained her composed posture. "I'm all right," she assured him, her voice carrying the same strength she used to calm his childhood fears. "These officers were just leaving." The way she said it made it sound more like a prediction than a suggestion. The son's presence seemed to change the very air around them. He loosened his tie slightly as he climbed the porch steps, his movements careful and non-threatening, despite the anger clearly visible in his eyes. The wooden boards creaked under his feet, the same boards that had announced his teenage sneaking attempts years ago. "Officers," he spoke, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who knew exactly where he stood legally. "I couldn't help but notice your vehicles from 3 blocks away. Would you mind explaining why you're questioning my mother on her own property?" His tone was professional, but there was an edge to it that made both officers straighten their postures. The senior officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we received reports of suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity," the son repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And what specifically about my 73-year-old mother sitting on her own porch, sorting through family photos, struck anyone as suspicious?" He gestured to the scattered photographs, some showing him as a young boy on this very porch. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence evaporating under the attorney's steady gaze. The crowd of neighbors had grown even larger, their phones still recording every word, every gesture. Mrs. Chen had been joined by her husband, both watching intently from their yard. The Wilson kids had stopped their live stream, but stood ready to resume at any moment. "We were simply following procedure," the senior officer began, but the son raised his hand, cutting him off with the practiced ease of someone who'd handled countless courtroom interruptions. "Let me be very clear," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "My mother has lived in this house for 40 years. She's a retired teacher who educated many of this city's children, possibly even some of your own. The only suspicious activity I'm seeing right now is the harassment of an elderly woman on her own property." Mrs. Rose watched her son with quiet pride, remembering the little boy who'd once declared he'd become a lawyer after watching her fight for better school funding. Now here he stood, using his knowledge to protect not just her, but the principles she'd taught him about dignity and justice. The tension on the porch was shifting now, power dynamics realigning like tectonic plates. The senior officer's hand had finally moved away from his belt, and his partner had taken a small step back. The gathering crowd sensed the change too, the atmosphere moving from concern to something closer to victory. Just then, another police car turned onto the street, this one moving slowly, deliberately. The son reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone with practiced ease. "Now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of legal experience, "shall we discuss badge numbers and probable cause, or would you prefer to explain yourselves to your supervisor?" The attorney's phone was already recording, its lens capturing every detail of the scene. He stood tall beside his mother's rocking chair, his presence a shield of legal knowledge and determination. The family photos on the table seemed to bear witness, generations of faces watching as their lessons in standing up for justice played out in real time. "Let's start with the basics," he began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd handled countless similar situations in courtrooms. "Under state law, officers must have reasonable suspicion based on specific, articulable facts before demanding identification from citizens on private property." He paused, letting the legal terminology sink in. "Would either of you care to share those specific facts?" The younger officer glanced at his partner, uncertainty clear on his face. The senior officer's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The crowd of neighbors had grown even larger, their presence adding weight to each passing moment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, highlighting the tension in the scene. "No? Then let's move on to discuss the Fourth Amendment," the son continued, his words precise and clear. "It protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. My mother, sitting on her own porch, has a reasonable expectation of privacy and freedom from unwarranted police interference." He gestured to the garden, the house, the very porch they stood on. "Every piece of this property has been in our family for 4 decades. Mrs. Rose remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, watching her son with quiet pride. She remembered the nights he'd spent studying law books at their kitchen table, his determination to make a difference growing stronger with each passing year. Now, those years of dedication were being put to powerful use. "I'm also concerned about the racial implications of this incident," he added, his voice level but firm. "Would you have responded to a suspicious activity report about an elderly woman sorting through photos on her porch in, say, the east side of town?" The question hung in the air like summer lightning, charged and impossible to ignore. The newly arrived police car had parked, and a supervisor stepped out, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. The son nodded in acknowledgement, but continued his measured speech. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Civilian Review Board. We'll need your badge numbers, names, and unit numbers." His phone continued recording as he listed each requirement. Mrs. Chen had moved even closer to her fence, her husband now holding their garden hose, both nodding in approval. The Wilson kids had resumed their live stream, capturing every word. Old Mr. Thompson had finally sat down on his lawn, his beagle settled quietly beside him, both watching the scene unfold. "Furthermore," the son continued, "I'll be requesting all body camera footage, dispatch recordings, and the original complaint that brought you here." He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to navigate the system. "We'll also need to discuss the threatening posture you've maintained throughout this encounter." The supervisor was walking up the path now, her face showing she already assessed the situation. The senior officer's earlier bravado had disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that this routine call had evolved into something much more significant. "Mom," the son said, turning slightly toward Mrs. Rose, while keeping the officers in view, "would you like to add anything to the record?" His question was both professional and personal, a son protecting his mother while an attorney gathered evidence. Mrs. Rose looked at the officers, her expression holding decades of wisdom and experience. "Just that I hope this becomes a teaching moment," she said, her educator's heart showing through even now. "Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home, on their own porch, in their own community." The wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze, their gentle sound a counterpoint to the tension. The supervisor had reached the bottom of the porch steps, and everyone could sense that the confrontation was about to enter its final phase. The son's phone kept recording, documenting every moment of this incident that had started as harassment but was transforming into something more: a lesson about justice, dignity, and the power of knowing your rights. The supervisor's presence changed the entire atmosphere on the porch. She took in the scene with experienced eyes. The elderly woman in her rocking chair, the family photos scattered on the table, the attorney's son with his phone still recording, and her two officers who looked increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. "Officers," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "I need you both to step back to your vehicles and wait for me there." Her tone left no room for argument. The two officers hesitated for just a moment before complying, their boots making heavy sounds on the wooden steps as they retreated. The gathered crowd watched the shift in power with visible relief. Mrs. Chen's husband had finally turned off their forgotten garden hose, the puddle at their feet reflecting the late afternoon sun. The Wilson kids' livestream had gained hundreds of viewers, their phones still raised to capture every moment of this unfolding story. "Ma'am," the supervisor addressed Mrs. Rose directly, her tone respectful and professional. "I want to extend my sincere apologies for this disturbance." She turned to the son, acknowledging his legal status with a slight nod. "We'll be conducting a full review of this incident." Mrs. Rose's son lowered his phone but didn't stop recording. "We appreciate that," he replied, his professional demeanor intact despite the emotion still visible in his eyes. "However, we'll still need those badge numbers and incident details for our records." The supervisor nodded, pulling out her own notepad. "Of course. I'll provide you with everything you need." She glanced back at her officers, who were now standing by their vehicles, their earlier confidence completely deflated. "Rest assured, this will be addressed in our next department-wide training session." Old Mr. Thompson had finally stood up from his lawn, his beagle wagging its tail as if sensing the changing mood. Mrs. Peterson's nurse wheeled her closer to get a better view of what she called justice in action. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath, watching history unfold on their neighbor's porch. "You know," Mrs. Rose spoke up, her voice carrying the wisdom of years spent teaching young minds, "this could be a valuable learning opportunity for everyone." She gestured to the crowd of neighbors, phones, and concerned faces. "Our community is watching, and they're learning important lessons about standing up for what's right." The supervisor took in these words, looking thoughtful. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. And I'd like to extend an invitation. Would you and your son consider speaking at our community relations workshop next month? We could all benefit from hearing your perspective." The son exchanged a look with his mother, years of shared understanding passing between them in that glance. "We'll consider it," he replied diplomatically, "after we've addressed the formal complaint and review process." A gentle breeze stirred the wind chimes again, their melody seeming more peaceful now that the tension had begun to dissolve. The family photos on the table caught the light, generations of faces seeming to smile at this moment of triumph. Even the officers by their vehicles stood straighter, as if accepting this lesson in humility and proper procedure. The supervisor finished writing in her notepad, tearing off several pages. "Here's my card, along with the incident number and all relevant information," she said, handing them to the son. "I'll personally oversee the review of this situation." Mrs. Rose's rocking chair creaked softly as she adjusted her position, her dignity never wavering. The afternoon light had turned golden, casting long shadows across her well-tended garden. What had started as an incident of harassment was transforming into a moment of community unity and positive change. The neighbors began to murmur among themselves, their phones lowering as they sensed the story reaching its resolution. The Wilson kids ended their livestream, but not before capturing the supervisor's apology and promise of action. This wasn't just about one afternoon on a porch anymore. It had become a testament to the power of knowing your rights and standing your ground with dignity. As the police vehicles pulled away from the curb, a wave of applause rippled through the gathered crowd. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood that had just witnessed something remarkable. Mrs. Rose remained in her rocking chair, her eyes glistening with unshed tears that reflected both pride and exhaustion. Her son loosened his tie completely now, settling down on the porch steps beside his mother's chair. The family photos still scattered on the table caught the golden light, faces of ancestors who had fought their own battles for dignity seeming to smile in approval. The moment felt both historic and deeply personal. "I'm sorry you had to rush over here," Mrs. Rose said softly, reaching out to pat her son's shoulder. He covered her hand with his own, shaking his head. "I'm not," he replied, his voice firm but gentle. "This is exactly why I became a lawyer. Every case I've ever handled led up to this moment, protecting my own mother's rights on our own porch." The neighbors began to drift closer, no longer held back by tension. Mrs. Chen approached with a fresh pot of her famous jasmine tea, while her husband followed with a tray of cups. Old Mr. Thompson brought over his homemade cookies, his beagle wagging its tail at all the attention. The Wilson kids had switched from live streaming to helping Mrs. Peterson's nurse wheel her closer to join the impromptu gathering. "You know," Mrs. Peterson called out, her voice quavering but strong, "I've lived on this street for 30 years, and I've never been prouder of our community than I am today." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the small crowd. Someone had brought out folding chairs, and neighbors were settling in for what was becoming an evening of sharing stories and strengthening bonds. Mrs. Rose's son pulled out his phone again, but this time to send a quick email to his law office. "Mom," he said, looking up with determination in his eyes, "I think it's time we organized that community rights workshop we've been talking about. People need to know their rights and how to stand up for them properly." His mother nodded, a teacher's spark lighting up her eyes. "We could use the community center," she suggested, pouring cups of jasmine tea for those gathered nearest. "I still have my old projector from my teaching days. We could make it a weekly session." The Wilson kids' parents stepped forward, offering to help spread the word through their social media networks. Mrs. Chen's husband, a graphic designer, volunteered to create flyers. Even old Mr. Thompson, a retired printer, offered his services for making handouts. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into a catalyst for positive change. As the evening deepened, more neighbors brought out snacks and drinks, turning the porch into an impromptu community meeting space. Stories began to flow. Tales of other incidents, moments of injustice, but also stories of triumph and solidarity. Each shared experience strengthened their resolve to make their community better. "You've always said that teaching moments come when you least expect them," Mrs. Rose's son remarked, watching the scene with satisfaction. The porch lights had come on automatically, casting a warm glow over the gathering. The wind chimes tinkled softly in the evening breeze, providing a gentle background melody to the conversations. Mrs. Rose looked out over her garden, where she'd spent countless hours tending to her flowers. Now it felt like she was watching something else bloom. A stronger, more united community. "Sometimes," she said thoughtfully, "standing your ground isn't just about holding your own space. It's about creating a space where everyone can stand together." The evening wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket, filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking teacups, and plans being made for future meetings. The incident that had begun with tension and fear had transformed into an opportunity for growth and connection. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mrs. Rose's porch had become more than just her sanctuary. It had become a symbol of dignity, justice, and the power of community standing together.